Jeffrey Epstein.
Jeffrey Epstein had 15 different phone numbers stored for Prince Andrew. Not 2, not 5, 15. That's not friendship. That's operational security for something that can't be traced. And here's where it gets strange. In 2008, he was convicted of soliciting prostitution from a minor. Over the next decade, MIT accepted $9.7 million from him. Harvard continued partnerships. JPMorgan Chase processed $290 million in his transactions. By every rational measure, this man should have been unemployable. Instead, after his conviction, he became more funded, more connected, and more protected. We still don't know who most of his financial clients were, and the offshore structures he used to hide them, still completely legal. So how does a convicted sex offender not only keep his job working with the world's elite, but actually get promoted within that world? The answer isn't what you think, and it's much worse. Now I know what you're thinking. We've all heard about Epstein, the island, the plane, the powerful friends, the sweetheart deal where he got work release privileges and spent 12 hours a day in his office instead of a cell. We know he was arrested again in 2019 and died in jail under suspicious circumstances. Some say Mossad, some say CIA, some say something else entirely. But here's what most coverage misses. The real mystery isn't who Epstein worked for. It's what he actually did all day that made him irreplaceable to people who could afford the best lawyers, accountants, and advisors in the world. Because here's the thing, Jeffrey Epstein was a college dropout with no financial certifications. His supposed hedge fund, Financial Science Partners, had 0 publicly verified clients. None. We don't have trading records, performance data, or a single confirmed investor who said, yes, Jeffrey managed my money and here's the return. For someone allegedly worth $578 million at his death, according to the Virgin Islands lawsuit, the paper trail is suspiciously thin. Leslie Wexner, the L Brand's CEO, gave him power of attorney over a fortune worth over $1 billion in the 1990s. Bill Clinton flew on his plane 26 times according to flight logs. Prince Andrew had those 15 phone numbers, and after his 2008 conviction became public record, when his name was literally on a sex offender registry, the money and connections didn't stop. If you're finding this angle interesting, hit that subscribe button. We're about to go deeper than the mainstream coverage. But what most people haven't noticed is that Epstein wasn't actually in the blackmail business. He was in a much more boring, much more legal, and much more profitable business. And that business is still operating today, even though he's gone. To understand what Epstein really did, you need to understand how offshore finance actually works. And I promise this is more disturbing than the conspiracy theories. Let's start with the basics. When you're ultra wealthy, and I'm talking hundreds of millions or billions, you face a problem. The US government wants to tax your income, your investments, your estate. They want transparency about where your money is and what you're doing with it. For most of human history, wealthy people just paid those taxes. They used domestic trusts, accepted high tax rates, and lived with limited privacy. But starting in the 1980s, a new option emerged: offshore structures in tax havens like the Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, and Panama. These jurisdictions offer something very valuable: near zero taxes and complete opacity. You can create a company in the Virgin Islands that pays 90% less in taxes through their Economic Development Commission program. You can use something called bearer shares, stock certificates with no names attached. Whoever physically holds the paper owns the company, or in plain English, completely untraceable ownership. You can appoint nominee directors, someone whose name is on the paperwork but who doesn't actually control anything. A legal decoy. This is called regulatory arbitrage, shopping for the jurisdiction with the loosest rules and then exploiting the gap between what's legal there and what's legal elsewhere. But here's the problem. If you're a billionaire and you personally set up these structures, it looks suspicious. It creates a paper trail connecting you to tax avoidance schemes. You need a middleman, someone local to the jurisdiction, someone who can touch the money without owning it, someone who manages the structures while you remain hidden. And here's the key insight. This is where it gets interesting. You need someone who's already compromised, someone who can never afford to turn state's witness or cooperate with investigators because they'd be exposing themselves. Epstein's actual business model was being a controllable liability. Being compromised didn't make him powerful, it made him useful. He couldn't expose his clients without exposing himself. Perfect incentive alignment for illegal activity. The trafficking made him vulnerable, which made him controllable, which made him valuable. Now, keep that Virgin Islands detail in mind because the government subsidies they gave him after his conviction will blow your mind. We'll get to that. But anyway, back to the mechanics of who was really winning in this arrangement. The surface level exploitation is obvious. The girls and women he trafficked. That's horrific and well documented. But there's a second layer of exploitation that's less visible and more systemic. The ultra wealthy clients, whose names we still don't know, avoided paying billions in taxes through these structures. The offshore jurisdictions collected incorporation fees and got economic activity. The enabler banks like JPMorgan and Deutsche Bank earned transaction fees processing hundreds of millions in suspicious transfers. And who loses? The trafficking victims, obviously, but also the U.S. Treasury, which loses approximately $40 billion per year in tax revenue to offshore structures, according to the Tax Justice Network. Public trust in institutions that chose money over accountability, and regular people who can't access these advantages and end up paying a higher effective tax rate than billionaires. The Virgin Islands has over 400,000 registered companies for a population of just 106,000 people, according to Government Accountability Office reports. Think about that ratio. Offshore tax havens hide an estimated $8.7 trillion in wealth globally, according to the International Monetary Fund in 2021. This isn't a fringe phenomenon. It's the primary way extreme wealth operates in the 21st century. But it gets worse. After Epstein's 2008 conviction became public record, when his name was literally on a sex offender registry, donations to elite scientific institutions didn't decrease, they increased. MIT's Media Lab accepted $9.7 million from him. Between 2008 and 2019, Harvard continued research partnerships. These institutions made a calculation. His money was worth more than their reputation. Now you might be thinking, maybe these donations were legitimate philanthropy? Hold that thought, because what these institutions also knew, what Harvard's president was told in letters, what MIT administrators debated internally, was that Epstein's conviction was public information.
And my residence address is 6100 Red Hook Boulevard in Virgin Islands.
Have you ever been convicted of a crime?
Yes.
They weren't fooled. They knew exactly who he was, and they took the money anyway. Why? Because in the world of high finance, a compromised middleman is often more valuable than a clean one. Someone who can never afford to cooperate with investigators, someone whose entire business model depends on discretion, someone who has more to lose than you do if the arrangement gets exposed. If this is making sense and you're realizing how deep this goes, smash that like button. But it gets worse. JPMorgan Chase wasn't just passively maintaining his accounts, they were actively processing transactions they knew were suspicious. Between 2008 and 2013, after his conviction, JPMorgan processed over $290 million for Epstein. Their compliance department flagged his accounts more than 20 times, according to internal documents that came out in Senate investigations in 2023. The bank's internal reviews noted his criminal conviction, the suspicious cash withdrawals, the payments to women with Eastern European surnames, and they continued processing the transactions anyway. The bank eventually paid $290 million in fines to Virgin Islands and U.S. regulators, which, for those keeping track, represents roughly 3% to 5% of the transaction volume they processed. That's not a penalty. That's a business expense. Deutsche Bank paid $75 million for taking over the relationship after JPMorgan finally dropped him in 2013. The banks did the math. The profit from processing his transactions exceeded the potential fines, so they kept going. Now, to play devil's advocate, maybe the banks just didn't have enough evidence to act, except they did. The compliance reports explicitly stated concerns about possible sex trafficking. The bank's own policies required them to close the accounts under these circumstances. They had the evidence, they had the authority, and they chose the transaction fees instead. For those keeping track, that's now educational institutions and major banks choosing money over accountability. But it gets worse, and this is where it becomes truly absurd. In 2013, the Virgin Islands government gave Epstein's company, Southern Trust, official Economic Development Commission benefits. These are tax incentives designed to attract legitimate businesses to create jobs and economic growth. They gave them to a convicted sex offender's shell company. 5 years after his conviction became public, the government subsidized his tax avoidance operation with taxpayer money, offering him up to 90% income tax reduction under their EDC program. Now, this isn't unique to the Virgin Islands. Panama, Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, Switzerland, they all compete for this business. It's a race to the bottom where jurisdictions offer increasingly aggressive tax advantages to attract wealthy clients. China's elite does the exact same thing, using middlemen in Hong Kong and Singapore to hide assets and avoid scrutiny. The difference, China occasionally executes their financial criminals as a warning to others. We give ours work release privileges and government subsidies. Remember those bearer shares I mentioned earlier? This is why they matter. Epstein's clients could own these Virgin Islands companies without their names appearing anywhere. The physical stock certificates exist, but there's no public registry of who holds them. And when the middleman is convicted, the actual owners just just wait it out, because nobody can prove who they are. The structure prevents exactly that discovery. Leslie Wexner, who I mentioned earlier, gave Epstein power of attorney over his entire fortune in the 1990s. We're talking over $1 billion in assets. To this day, we don't fully know what Epstein did with that control. Wexner has claimed he cut ties in 2007, but the offshore structures Epstein created, those can persist indefinitely, long after the relationship officially ends. Either way, the system kept protecting him. And oh, would you look at that? We still haven't answered who his actual clients were. There's a reason for that. Which brings us to the really disturbing part, but it gets worse one final time. We still don't know who most of Epstein's actual financial clients were, not because the investigation was incomplete, because the structures are specifically designed to prevent that discovery. Bearer share corporations don't require disclosure of beneficial owners. Nominee directors shield the actual decision makers, and all of this is completely legal under Virgin Islands and international law. According to World Bank anti-money laundering reports, only an estimated 10% to 15% of beneficial owners in offshore structures are identifiable through public records. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. The opacity is the feature, not a bug. Now, to be fair, offshore structures aren't automatically illegal. Plenty of legitimate businesses use them for legal tax planning and asset protection. International corporations need structures in multiple jurisdictions for operational reasons. But when the primary benefit of a system is opacity, and that opacity enables crime, and the penalty for enabling crime is less than the profit from enabling crime, the distinction between legal and right becomes meaningless. Post-Epstein, various reforms have been proposed in Congress. As of 2024, zero significant legislation has passed that would actually close these loopholes. The Virgin Islands EDC program, still active, still offering the same incentives, still attracting the same kinds of clients. If this continues, and it will, we'll see more Epsteins. Not necessarily the trafficking part, but the financial architecture. The next person who figures out how to make themselves unfireable to the ultra-wealthy through legal complexity and personal compromise is probably already operating. They're just being more careful about the compromising part, learning from his mistakes. And we won't know about them until it's too late, because that's exactly how the system is designed to work. You can't boycott your way out of offshore finance. You can't vote your way out of international tax arbitrage. This requires coordination between countries that actively compete to offer the loosest regulations, which means it requires exactly the kind of international cooperation that the system itself is designed to prevent. For those keeping track, that's educational institutions, major banks, government agencies, and the international regulatory system, all failing simultaneously. Not because of incompetence, because the incentives reward failure. So back to those 15 phone numbers for Prince Andrew. They weren't for blackmail calls, they weren't for friendship. They were operational security for financial transactions that couldn't leave a traceable pattern. Different numbers for different types of communications. Perhaps one for scheduling, one for urgent matters, others for specific transaction types or intermediaries. That's not how you manage relationships. That's how you manage liability. And now we know why he needed that level of compartmentalization. The greatest trick Epstein pulled wasn't convincing people he was a genius financier when he wasn't. It was convincing people his power came from blackmail, when it actually came from being the middleman in a legal tax avoidance system. The blackmail theory makes us feel better. It suggests someone that evil must have supernatural leverage over the powerful. The truth is more banal. He was useful because he was expendable, and when you're useful enough, even being a convicted sex offender isn't enough to get you fired. This is what functional immunity looks like in the 21st century. You don't need to be above the law if you can make yourself necessary to people who are. The penalty for soliciting a minor is prison. Unless you're managing offshore structures for billionaires, then it's work release and government subsidies. Epstein is dead. The banks paid fines that were a fraction of their profits. The universities kept the money. No clients were identified or charged. The structures remain legal. The next person is already out there, just being more careful. If you want to understand more about how offshore finance works, check out our video on the Panama Papers, and don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how money works.